Hello friends, welcome back to my channel. If you like scary stories, hit subscribe, like the video, and share with your friends. Thanks. I had just turned 20 and decided to spend a weekend at my uncle's cabin in the woods. It was a place I had gone to many times as a kid, full of memories of fishing trips and campfires. But this time something felt off. The trees seemed thicker, and the air was heavy with a strange quiet. As I unpacked my stuff, I noticed my uncle had left some things behind. A flashlight, a first aid kit, and a couple of fishing rods. The cabin was old, with wooden walls and a stone fireplace, but I loved it. After getting settled in, I thought about taking a walk along the nearby trail that led to a small lake, hoping to catch a few fish for dinner. The sun was high when I set off, and I felt the warmth on my back as I walked. The trail was familiar, but as I went deeper into the woods, the trees closed in around me, blocking out the sunlight. I pushed on, brushing aside branches and trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine. The woods felt alive, as if they were whispering secrets I couldn't understand. When I finally reached the lake, it was beautiful and calm, surrounded by tall pine trees and the soft sound of water lapping at the shore. I fished for a while, enjoying the peace, but my mind kept drifting back to the strange feeling I had in the woods. After an hour with no bites, I decided to head back to the cabin. As I retraced my steps, I started to feel uneasy. It was like someone was watching me. Every rustle in the bushes made my heart race. I hurried along the path, glancing over my shoulder. Nothing was there, but the feeling didn't fade. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sat on the couch, trying to shake off my unease. I made some instant noodles for dinner, but my hunger was gone. Instead, I grabbed the flashlight and decided to look around the property. I wanted to calm my nerves and tell myself everything was fine. The night was dark, with only the moonlight filtering through the trees. I walked to the edge of the clearing, shining the light into the thick woods. The beam bounced off the tree trunks and vanished into the shadows. I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my eye, a quick flash of white. I told myself it was just my imagination, but that didn't ease the tightness in my chest. Suddenly, I heard a loud noise, something heavy crashing through the underbrush. My heart raced as I froze, listening closely. The sound stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I stood there, frozen, wondering if I should call for help or simply run inside. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity held me in place. I took a deep breath and turned the flashlight toward the sound, but nothing was there. The light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, this time closer, like something big was moving through the woods. I felt a rush of fear and sprinted back to the cabin, fumbling with the door as I fished for the key. Once inside, I locked the door and peered out the window. My hands shook as I gripped the flashlight, scanning the edge of the forest. I saw nothing, just rustling leaves and the faint glow of the moon. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat in the dim light of the cabin, listening to the silence around me, but it felt heavy. I decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would wash away the tension. But as I lay under the covers, I couldn't close my eyes. The night dragged on, and every sound made my heart race. Around midnight, I heard a loud thud against the side of the cabin. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the window, shining the light outside. Nothing, just darkness and the trees standing still. But then I saw it. A figure, barely visible, standing in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was too big to be an animal. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. What was it? Person? Something else? I backed away slowly, trying to stay quiet, and decided to barricade the door with anything I could find. I shoved the couch against it and curled up in a corner, my flashlight flickering as my hands shook. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening to the creaking of the cabin and the whisper of the wind through the trees. Eventually, I heard the figure move away, the sounds fading into the distance. I waited until dawn, too scared to sleep. As the first light broke through the trees, I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. The clearing was quiet, but I noticed something unsettling. The grass where the figure had stood was flattened, as if someone had been lurking there for hours. I quickly gathered my things, not wanting to stay another minute. I left the cabin, locking the door behind me. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, feeling a chill run down my spine. I vowed never to return alone. The woods might seem pretty, but beneath their calm surface was a darkness I couldn't understand. As I drove down the narrow road, I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were still watching me. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone standing at the cabin, waiting. And just as I turned a corner, I thought I saw a shadow flicker past the trees, almost like a warning. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I had disturbed something that should have been left alone. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I never planned to return, but deep down, I knew that the woods wouldn't let me forget. I could still feel their eyes on me, as if they were waiting for the next person to wander too far into their depths. My brother-in-law Jake and his friend Mike asked me to join them for the weekend at their cabin in the woods. I was looking forward to getting away from the city and enjoying some fresh air. The cabin was old but comfortable, surrounded by tall trees that rustled softly in the wind. We arrived late on Friday night. The sun had set, leaving long shadows on the ground. As we unpacked, I felt a weird sense of worry. It was like the woods were closing in on us, and I heard faint sounds, like twigs snapping in the distance. I tried to push it away, telling myself I was just being overly cautious. That night, we lit a fire outside and roasted marshmallows. The flames danced, and for a moment, everything seemed perfect. But as it got darker, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I glanced at Jake and Mike, but they were lost in their laughter and stories. When it was time to sleep, I decided to take a quick walk around the cabin. The moon was bright, lighting up the path through the trees. I felt a little calmer being outside. But as I walked, I suddenly heard something, heavy footsteps following me, just out of sight. My heart raced as I stopped to listen. The sound stopped too. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. I turned back toward the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I picked up my pace, my footsteps echoing in the quiet. Just as I reached the porch, I glanced back and saw a figure standing between the trees. It was tall, but I couldn't see any details. Panic rushed through me, and I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. Jake and Mike were already asleep, completely unaware of my fear. I lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the footsteps again, getting closer and circling the cabin. I felt trapped and scared, unable to reach for my phone without making noise. The next morning, I told Jake and Mike what I had experienced, but they laughed it off. "You probably just heard things," Jake said. I still couldn't shake the sense of dread I felt. That day, we decided to go hiking, hoping it would clear my mind. As we walked deeper into the woods, I felt like someone was watching us. Jake and Mike were chatting ahead of me, but I kept looking back, expecting to see that figure again. Later, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. Vines covered the walls, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Curiosity got the better of us, and we approached it, Inside, the air felt stale and had a weird smell. Broken furniture lay scattered, and strange symbols covered the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine. We didn't stay long, but as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something outside the window. My heart raced again. There was that tall figure I had seen before, standing at the edge of the woods, completely still. It didn't move, but I felt its eyes on me, a chilling intensity that made me shiver. I called for Jake and Mike, but they were too far ahead, and I was too scared to move closer to the window. I turned to run but tripped over a piece of broken furniture, crashing to the floor. The figure seemed to step forward, and I scrambled to my feet, racing back into the woods, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. When I finally caught up with Jake and Mike, they looked worried. I explained what had happened, but they insisted we stick together and return to the cabin. Reluctantly, I followed them, still glancing over my shoulder. As night fell, we locked ourselves inside, the fire flickering in the corner. I felt a bit safer behind the walls, but I knew that figure was still out there. We stayed up late, talking and trying to laugh off the fear, but my stomach twisted with anxiety. Around midnight, a loud bang on the door jolted me awake. My heart stopped. Jake and Mike were still asleep. I quietly got up and peeked through a crack in the curtains. The woods were dark, but I could see shadows moving just outside the cabin. A wave of nausea washed over me. I stood frozen, listening as the banging grew louder. It sounded like something was trying to break in. I glanced at my sleeping companions, wondering if I should wake them or if that would just make things worse. Then, the banging stopped suddenly, and an eerie silence fell over the cabin. I took a deep breath and slowly opened the door to peek outside. The moonlight showed nothing but darkness. I stepped outside, scanning the area, every nerve in my body on edge. That's when I saw it. A glimpse of the figure standing among the trees, just watching. Without thinking, I yelled for Jake and Mike, my voice filled with urgency. They rushed outside, groggy and confused. As they came out, the figure stepped back into the shadows. We stood there, breathless, unsure of what to do next. The three of us decided we needed to leave right away. We packed our bags in a hurry, adrenaline pushing us to move fast. As we drove away from the cabin, I looked back, my heart still racing. The woods seemed dark and threatening behind us. Even though we made it home safely, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the trees, waiting for the right moment to strike. The woods felt alive, hiding secrets that should never have been uncovered. As I lay in bed that night, I realized that whatever was out there had not just been a figment of my imagination. It had been real, and it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. I had always liked the idea of a cabin getaway. Just me, the woods, and a few days of peace to recharge. I found a small cabin deep in the forest, far away from the noise of the city. My plan was to disconnect and enjoy nature. But as soon as I got there, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. The cabin was old and creaked with the wind. I pushed open the door, and the musty smell hit me hard. Dust danced in the sunlight coming through the dirty windows. I tried to shake off the unease and unpacked my things, telling myself everything would be fine. That first night, I lit a fire and got comfortable with a book. As I turned the pages, I heard something outside. A branch snapped and my heart raced. I stood up and looked out the window, but the darkness revealed nothing. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. The sounds of the forest surrounded me, and I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I hiked along a narrow trail that went deeper into the woods. I found a beautiful clearing filled with wildflowers. The sun was bright, and I felt a little better. But something still didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Later, I returned to the cabin to eat and rest. As I sat on the porch, I noticed a strange shape by the edge of the woods. It was too far away to see clearly, but it seemed out of place. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward it, my heart pounding with every step. As I got closer, my stomach twisted in knots. It was a body, a man half covered by leaves and dirt. His skin was pale and lifeless, and I could see a deep cut on his neck. I stumbled back, fear coursing through my veins. Panic took over, and I turned to run back to the cabin, but I stopped short. I had to know what had happened. I searched the area, but there were no signs of a struggle or anything that would explain his death. I felt heavy dread as I considered the implications. Was he a victim of a crime? Or had he simply gotten lost and met a terrible end? I rushed back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. My mind raced with thoughts. I needed to leave, but I didn't want to go out into the dark forest. I sat up, clutching a knife I found in the kitchen, listening for any signs of danger. Around midnight, I heard it, a noise coming from outside. It sounded like footsteps, slow and steady. My heart raced as I peered through a crack in the curtains. I saw a shadow moving near the trees. I held my breath, fear wrapping around me like a cold blanket. After a long moment, the figure stepped into the moonlight, and I felt a wave of relief. It was just a deer, but the tension still hung in the air. I knew I had to leave as soon as the sun came up. As the sun rose, I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking with fear. Just before I left, I glanced back at the forest, my heart pounding. The image of the body haunted my mind. As I drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something lurking in the trees behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I pulled into a gas station and told the clerk what I had found. He turned pale and immediately called the police. I sat in my car, shaking, feeling both relieved and terrified. They said they would send someone to check the cabin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had escaped something much worse than just a dead body. Weeks later, I read in the local news that they had identified the man. He had been reported missing months ago, and the police believed he had been murdered. I thought about what could have happened if I hadn't found him, or if I had stayed there any longer. That cabin, which had once seemed like a peaceful getaway, now felt like a place filled with dark secrets. I found myself wondering about the killer. Who were they? Were they still out there watching and waiting? The thought sent shivers down my spine. I promised myself I would never return to those woods, knowing that some places hide horrors better left alone. The idea that the forest might hold more bodies, more secrets, filled my mind as I lay awake at night, every rustle outside my window making me jump. The woods had taken a part of me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it would always be watching, waiting for someone else to wander too far into its dark embrace. I had been working in the woods for weeks, staying alone in a small cabin I rented from a local guy. The cabin was surrounded by thick trees and far away from any neighbors. I was there to clear some land for my job and enjoyed the quietness. But as the days went by, things began to feel weird. One night, while sitting by the fire, I heard a sound outside. At first, it was soft, like branches snapping, but then it grew louder and more constant. I stood up and walked to the window, looking into the darkness. I saw nothing but the dark shapes of the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. I shook my head, telling myself it was just a deer or something harmless. The next day, while I was working, I spotted strange marks on the trees near the cabin. They looked like deep scratches, as if someone had dragged something sharp across the bark. A shiver ran down my back, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe some kids were playing nearby, or it was just an animal marking its spot. As the sun went down that evening, I decided to make some dinner and then go to bed early. I was worn out from working all day. While I was cleaning up, I suddenly heard a loud thud against the cabin wall. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The night air was chilly, and the shadows seemed darker than before. I looked around, the light from my flashlight slicing through the dark. Then, I saw something near the tree line. More scratches on the bark, leading away from the cabin. I felt my breath quicken as I followed the marks, my heart pounding and my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. After a few minutes, I found a clearing. In the middle stood an old, abandoned cabin that looked like it had been there for years. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung off its hinges. I felt a strong urge to turn back, but my curiosity pulled me closer. As I got closer, I noticed the ground was covered with old bones and scraps of clothing. A wave of fear washed over me. This was no normal place, it felt wrong. Suddenly, I heard another sound behind me, sharp and close. I spun around quickly, but there was nothing there. Panic surged through me. I bolted back toward my cabin, my feet pounding against the forest floor. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. I could hear the wind howling outside, but the sound of my own heartbeat was louder. I felt safe, at least for now. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the thud against the wall, followed by the scratching noise. My mind raced. I was sure I had left something outside, or maybe someone had followed me back from that old cabin. I lay still, listening, every creak of the cabin sounding like footsteps approaching. The next morning, I knew I had to get out of there. I packed my things, my heart still racing, and headed out to my truck. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin. In the distance, I saw a figure standing by the tree line, watching me go. I couldn't make out any details, but the feeling of being watched sent a chill down my spine. The drive home felt endless, every shadow by the road making me jump. I finally reached the safety of my town and promised myself never to return to those woods. Even now, I think about that cabin and the strange noises at night. I wonder about the old cabin in the clearing and who or what was out there. I learned the hard way that some places are better left alone. But what truly haunts me is the thought of that figure watching me drive away. I can still picture it in my mind, standing there, unmoving. It felt like it was waiting for me to come back, and part of me knows I never should have left that night. Those woods still whisper secrets, dark and twisted, and I can't shake the feeling that they want me back, that something sinister lies just out of sight, waiting for the moment I return. The sun had gone down hours ago when I finally reached the old cabin at the edge of the village. I had rented it for a quiet weekend escape, hoping to get away from the noise of the city. It was supposed to be a peaceful spot, surrounded by fields and thick woods, far from all the commotion. But as I got closer, a sense of unease settled in my stomach. The cabin was small and worn down, with paint peeling off and a creaky porch. I opened the door, and the wood groaned as if protesting my arrival. Inside, the air was stale, and a musty smell hung in the corners. I lit a few candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows that danced around the room. It was cozy enough, but something felt wrong. That night, I settled in with a book while a small fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Outside, the wind howled, and I heard noises that made my heart race. Was it just the wind, or did I hear faint whispers drifting through the trees? I shook it off, trying to focus on my book. But every so often, I glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone standing in the dark. Around midnight, a loud thud came from outside, followed by the sound of something dragging across the ground. My heart raced as I put down my book, straining to listen. The sounds got closer, echoing in the stillness. I peeked through the window but saw nothing, just blackness. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but I felt an overwhelming urge to find out what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the cabin door. The cool night air hit me and I shivered. The beam of my flashlight cut through the dark, revealing nothing but shadows and tall grass swaying in the breeze. I took a few careful steps into the yard. As I walked further from the cabin, the dragging noise stopped. My flashlight flickered, and dread washed over me. Just as I turned to head back, I saw it, a dark shape behind a nearby tree. My breath caught in my throat as I froze, my heart racing. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked too big to be an animal. Instinct kicked in, and I turned to sprint back to the cabin. My feet pounded the ground as I dashed toward the door, glancing back just once. The shape had moved from behind the tree, now standing out in the open, watching me. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. Panic flooded my mind as I felt the weight of the silence outside. I quickly shoved a chair against the door, feeling foolish but terrified. I sat on the floor with my back against the door, the flashlight flickering in my trembling hands. Minutes stretched into hours as I listened closely for any signs of movement. Finally, the night began to brighten. The first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the wood. The cabin felt more peaceful, but I was still on edge. Cautiously, I peeked out through the window. The yard looked normal, and the shadows of the trees stood still. There was no sign of the shape from the night before. I decided to check the area around the cabin. I stepped outside, keeping my flashlight ready. As I scanned the ground, my heart sank when I noticed something. A trail of disturbed grass leading away from the cabin toward the woods. I followed it slowly, my heart pounding again. It led to a small clearing, where I spotted the remains of an old farm shed, long abandoned. I approached the shed and looked inside. My stomach twisted at what I found. A pile of old tools and bits of wood, but scattered among them were pieces of clothing torn and dirty. They looked like they had been there for years, covered in grime. It hit me that this place wasn't just a cabin. It had a dark history I didn't know. Feeling a chill creep down my spine, I backed away slowly, realizing that whatever had been out there last night was likely connected to the remnants of the past. I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. The sun was fully up now, and as I looked out the window, I felt a mix of relief and dread. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The village might seem quiet, but it held secrets I wasn't ready to uncover. I quickly packed my things and left the cabin behind, unease still gnawing at my mind. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin and the woods surrounding it, wondering what truly lurked there, hidden from the world. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the village that I noticed something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing at the cabin's window, watching me drive away. My heart dropped, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind. As I sped down the road, I glanced back one last time, and in that fleeting moment, I swore I saw the figure wave goodbye. Some places are better left alone, and some stories are better forgotten. I couldn't shake the thought that I was not alone in that cabin, and the truth about what lived there might be far worse than I could ever imagine. I've always loved our family cabin, hidden away in the woods of southern Brazil. It's old and creaky, a place full of memories where my family used to gather for summer vacations. Recently, I decided to spend a weekend there by myself, hoping to reconnect with nature and relive those special moments. The cabin sat at the edge of a huge, thick forest. I arrived in the late afternoon, with the sun shining through the leaves and casting shadows that danced on the ground. I unpacked my things, set up a small fire pit outside, and prepared to enjoy a quiet evening. As night fell, I made dinner and settled in, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and the crackling fire. As darkness wrapped around the cabin, a strange feeling crept over me. I tried to shake it off, thinking it was just because I was alone. I curled up on the couch with a book, hoping to distract myself. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises from outside, like footsteps or something scratching against the cabin's wooden walls. I kept telling myself it was just animals. After all, I was in their territory. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. I checked that all the windows were locked and the door was shut tight. But sleep didn't come easily. The cabin felt too quiet, and the darkness felt too thick. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again, scratching. This time it was louder and more demanding. I froze, listening hard. The sound seemed to come from the back of the cabin. Heart racing, I got up and peered through the window. The moonlight lit up the yard, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I turned off the light, hoping to calm down and get some sleep. But sleep was impossible. The scratching continued, mixed with the sound of something heavy banging against the walls. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way to the back door. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet, and I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door, and the cold night air hit my face. I shone the flashlight around the yard, but all I could see was the dark, quiet forest surrounding me. The scratching had stopped. Just as I was about to close the door, I heard a low growl coming from the shadows. I aimed the flashlight in that direction, and my heart dropped. There, partly hidden among the trees, was a huge wild boar, its eyes shining in the beam of my flashlight. It looked hungry and angry, its tusks gleaming as it snorted. Panic surged through me. I knew these animals could be dangerous, especially if they felt threatened. My instincts kicked in, and I quickly shut the door, locking it tight. I could hear the boar crashing through the brush, its growls echoing in the stillness. My mind raced. I needed to protect myself. I grabbed a kitchen knife and climbed up to the loft, my heart pounding in my chest. From the loft, I could see the yard, but the boar had moved away, disappearing into the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the rest of the night on edge, listening for any sign of it returning. My ears strained for the sound of those heavy footsteps or the growl of the boar. As dawn finally broke, casting a weak light over the cabin, I peeked outside. To my relief, there was no sign of the boar. I was exhausted but thankful to have made it through the night. As the sun rose higher, I felt the urge to leave the cabin behind for now. I quickly packed my things, eager to get out of there. I knew I would come back when the weather was warmer and the animals less aggressive. But that day, I just wanted to be away from the woods. I drove away, but as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trees seemed to lean in closer as I passed, their shadows stretching and twisting like hands reaching for me. Then, just as I rounded a bend in the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. My stomach dropped. There, standing at the edge of the woods, was the boar again, its eyes locked onto mine. It was a chilling sight, as if it were marking me. I sped up, but the feeling lingered, an unshakable sense that I had disturbed something in those woods, something that wouldn't forget me so easily. I couldn't help but think about what else might be lurking in the darkness, waiting for the next chance to emerge. I realized then that I might have left the cabin, but the woods still held me in their grip. Some memories are best left undisturbed, and I knew I wouldn't be able to escape that feeling anytime soon. The rain came down hard as I pulled up to the cabin, my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had been excited for this weekend getaway for weeks, eager to escape the city and enjoy some peace in nature. But as I stepped out of my truck, a chill in the air made me shiver. The trees danced wildly in the wind, their branches reaching up like desperate hands trying to grab the sky. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The cabin was small but cozy, with a fireplace and a few windows looking out at the dark woods. I set my things down and lit a fire, watching the crackling flames cast flickering shadows on the walls. I poured myself a drink and sank into an old chair, listening to the rain hammering on the roof. It was quiet and calming, but something about the night felt off. As the hours passed, the rain got heavier and the wind howled outside. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach as the darkness closed in around me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, I was alone in the woods, and the storm outside was just nature acting up. But deep down, the silence felt heavy, like something was lurking just out of sight. I decided to check the cabin's windows, needing to see what was outside. I walked around, peering out at the sheets of rain that blurred my view. The trees were shrouded in darkness, and I couldn't see anything beyond their outlines. But when I looked out the last window, I froze. A figure stood in the distance, half hidden by the trees, its shape barely visible in the shadows. Panic shot through me. I quickly backed away from the window, my heart pounding. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The wind must have been making the branches sway, creating strange shapes. But then I remembered the last time I had been here, 2 years ago, when there had been news about a missing hiker in the area. Standing in the dim light of the cabin, I felt exposed. My thoughts raced, wondering if I was truly alone. I turned off the lights and sat quietly in the dark, straining to listen. The rain roared like a monster outside, but there was something else, rustling outside, just beyond the cabin walls. With every sound, my anxiety grew. I picked up a flashlight from the table, its beam cutting through the dark. I aimed it at the windows, ready to face whatever was out there. But as I shone the light around, I saw nothing, just the rain, the wind, and the thick darkness pressing in on me. Then I heard it again, a soft thump against the side of the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. I tried to tell myself it could be nothing, maybe a branch falling, but fear held me tight. The thump came again, louder this time. I moved to the window closest to the sound and looked out, the flashlight shaking in my hands. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, just outside the cabin, was a man. His clothes were soaked and torn, and his eyes shone with a wild look. He was staring straight at me, a twisted grin spreading across his face. My breath caught in my throat as I realized he wasn't just some lost hiker. He looked like someone who had been out here for far too long, someone who had lost their mind. I stumbled back, fear gripping me. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The operator answered, but my voice barely came out as a whisper. I could hear the man outside moving closer, knocking on the walls now, a steady beat that echoed through the cabin. I pressed myself against the wall, waiting for the police to arrive. I could hear sirens in the distance, but they felt like they were miles away. The man continued his slow, steady knocks, each sound sending chills down my spine. Finally, the sirens grew louder, and the man stepped back from the cabin, still watching me with that disturbing grin. I saw flashing lights outside as the police arrived. They shouted, their voices breaking through the tension of the storm. I rushed to the door and opened it, my heart racing as I stepped out to meet them. The officers quickly took charge, scanning the area. They spotted the man, who had begun to back away into the trees, and chased after him. I watched, my heart still pounding, as they yelled for him to stop. The rain fell harder, but I felt a wave of relief wash over me. After a tense few minutes, the officers returned, holding the man between them. They said he had been reported missing a while back, lost in the woods. As they led him away, I felt thankful but also shaken. I was safe now, but that twisted smile was burned into my mind. I spent the rest of the night awake in the cabin, the rain still pouring down outside. The storm couldn't touch the sense of relief I felt, but it couldn't wash away the fear that lingered. I knew I'd never forget this rainy night, the terror I faced, and how close I had come to something awful. But as the hours passed, a new worry crept in. What if the man had friends? What if he hadn't been alone out there? I thought about the way he looked at me, as if he knew something I didn't. I glanced at the dark windows, half expecting to see him again, that smile still haunting my thoughts. I finally decided to gather my things and leave. As I prepared to head out, I noticed something by the door. A muddy footprint, larger than my own, leading away into the darkness. My heart sank. The storm raged on, and I realized the nightmare wasn't over. I had escaped one danger, but the woods were still full of unknown threats, waiting silently in the rain.